Hello again and welcome to the Memoir channel. Today I am super excited to be talking with Douglas Rogers about his memoir, The Last Resort. It's a memoir of mischief and mayhem on a family farm in Africa. So Douglas is an award-winning author, a travel writer. He's a journalist with over 20 years of experience. He has written for some of the world's leading magazines like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the Daily Telegraph, National Geographic Traveler, and oh my gosh, I enjoyed his memoir so much because I grew up in South Africa, so I could really relate to so much of it. If you haven't read it, please read it. It's really remarkable. And let's go and speak to Douglas and find out a little bit more. Hi, Douglas, and welcome to the Memoir channel.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me, Nikki.
I am absolutely thrilled to have you on as a guest, and I'm going to try not to gush all over you because I really, really enjoyed your memoir. And probably because I grew up in South Africa, so it felt very relatable to me. But I wanted to ask, first of all, how long it took you to write? Like once you knew that's what you wanted to write about, how long did it actually take you?
Um, it's hard to say because I had this idea for a long time, and then I wrote a proposal, which took me maybe maybe a year,
Okay.
and
Okay.
and then it was time to write the book, and then it took me ages to find the voice that I needed, that I wanted.
Oh,
And
that's
it's strange
interesting.
because
Yeah,
yeah,
because it
but then
seems
as
so
soon as
natural. Yeah.
but then when you find that voice, then I found it easy and it
Hmm.
was quick, but it's just getting your head into that
Into
space
the
takes forever and it's agonizing, right?
right. And then were you writing while you were there, or were you actually in London, or I know you're in different parts of the world?
Uh, Good question. No, I wrote it all in New York. I
Okay.
was living in New York at the time, so I'd written like magazine pieces and pieces for the Telegraph and I think the Guardian when I lived in London about my parents and about that farm. But when I wrote the book, that was in the probably in about 2008,
Hmm.
2008 maybe 2009. I wrote all in New York where I was living.
Okay. Okay. And then did your parents have a bit of input for you? I mean, because, there's a lot of conversations and things with them. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. They not no not they didn't have any input on the writing. I didn't send them. I don't think I even sent them chapters. But I spoke to them obviously all the time, and they
Yeah.
knew I was writing it.
Yeah.
But I didn't send them any. And I maybe I'd sort of there was some stuff that maybe I'd send them a paragraph or try to find out something factual from them and email them a section. But I didn't
Right.
go through. It wasn't like, oh, I want you to approve this and
Okay.
is this okay? And no, I didn't do any of that. And
And
funnily enough, I don't even think my dad read the book. But
no, that's
no, I don't think he
impossible.
did. My mom did, and my dad loved it because it made him quite famous. But I don't think he actually sat down and read it.
Well, I mean, the thing is, when you're reading it, for me, right, I fall in love with your parents. I mean, they're heroic and they're so, I mean, their whole approach to life, it's wonderful. So I'm wondering if, as you were writing it, your feelings on them sort of changed or deepened
Yeah,
or, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So that whole thing is kicked off in about 2000, 2001, right? The whole like land invasion stuff. And
Right.
I was working in London as a travel writer, and then my parents now suddenly find themselves caught up in this huge story that was covered all over the world, particularly in the UK. And I started writing. I wrote a couple of pieces about them and what they were going through, and I wrote them. And I remember like my parents read one, and I don't think they liked it because it made them seem like victims, and it made them seem helpless
Ah,
and I remember that reaction from them. And it took me years, as I was saying, like the idea of the book probably started around then, but it took me years to work out that I had to write something very different about who they were. And that was the process of like understanding who they were, like
mm,
realizing that, or you could write about something funny, or you could find, you can learn things as a child about your own parents as you get older and that you didn't know. And you realize that I have children, right? Like, you
Hmm.
know everything when you're a teenager or when you're in your 20s, right?
Right.
Then you grow up and you realize actually your parents are smarter than you and probably know a lot more about how the world works.
And were you sort of in your, I presume you were in your 30s when you were writing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was born in 68. So, yeah, yeah, actually older than that. Born in 68. So I was writing in 2008. So I
I'm
was
really bad
40,
with numbers.
late
Yeah,
30s.
okay.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that is round about the time when you start seeing your parents differently anyway, even if you're
Yes,
not writing
exactly.
a, writing a whole book about them. But I mean, there were just so many little gems in there. And there was one thing you wrote where you said about the steam rising after the rain and how it made you feel giddy drunk. And I was like, yes, I know that feeling. I love it. And it's almost something, I feel like there's a thing in Africa that you can't really explain to people that haven't experienced it because it's sort of magical, isn't
Yeah.
it?
There was one book I read. Like everyone, I think, can tell a story, but I think what really helped me was like being descriptive and being able to. You just mentioned that line, being able to describe something. I read a. Do you know the writer Laurie Lee, who wrote Cider with Rosie and As I Walked Out one midsummer morning, British
Yes,
writer.
yes.
And a friend of mine had said, like, if you want to write great description, read this book. And I read it, and it sort of just put me in a different way of a headspace about how to describe things. He obviously wasn't writing about Africa, but being
Just
able to get that sort of smell of a
to
place,
capture it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it's good to read that kind of writing. What I worked out was if you're writing about, so that was obviously a very particular story about Zimbabwe or Africa. Don't necessarily read other books that are like that, but read something that can convey um,
Right.
the mood of that.
Um,
Yeah.
yes. Now, hang on. I was going to say something that's going straight out of my head. Oh, I was going to say, when I was sort of, researching, I found all these different covers for your book. And there's
Yeah.
one, right? There's one, the frog one is the one, that's the one, I have that one.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's one with a swimming pool and I think it's empty. And is that
Yeah.
that's the actual place,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Yeah. It's the actual pool. I had a very strange process with that book because I sold it first in the US, and then I kept the rights for the Commonwealth, which is like UK, South Africa. And then I separated even those and had a different publisher in South Africa as well. So I had three different publishers. And
Ah,
that was the South African cover, was the one with the swimming pool that you're
oh,
talking
okay. Okay, because yeah,
about.
there was another cover as well. I think there was actually four that I came across,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, there are at least four. And I think South Africa's had three or four on its own. And
Oh,
then the UK had two or three, and then the US has had two, but variations on the frog.
yeah. Now,
Yeah.
which place do you think it was the best received? Like which, or
Uh,
is it hard to gauge?
well, definitely the UK and South Africa and
Yeah,
Zimbabwe. Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, I did really well there. I get royalties from it in the US still.
I'm sure. And I mean,
So
it's what, 14 years since it was
yeah, it's
released?
been a while though. So yeah, I think I wrote it in 2008. It came out in 2009, and then the paperback I think in 2010, or the UK version. Yeah, so 14 years.
And are there other stories? I mean, there must be, but I can't think of one. I can't think of one that sticks out as much as yours about that time. Like I think,
Uh, Not really. Let me think. That's sort of about what was Peter the when a crocodile ate the sun came just before that, I guess. A similar period, but his family lived in Harare and
uh-huh,
going through a very different experience to what my parents were doing. Not really about that farm stuff or
right,
land
right. The land
um,
seizure stuff.
from a white
Yeah, it's
perspective, I guess. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
um, yeah. And then okay. So I want to ask you, um, h- how are your parents now? Because I have no updates, so I don't know where they are. If they're still going, if they still have the place. I don't even
No,
know if
sadly,
that's
both
still.
my parents have passed away.
Ah, I'm so
Uh,
sorry.
yeah, thank you. My mom died in 2018. Do you remember the little incident? I wrote another book, 2 weeks in
2 weeks in
November.
November.
Yeah, so this was about the coup that got rid of Mugabe.
Yes.
Um, so that my mom died soon after that, 2018, and then my dad died in 2022.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah,
And
so they
and
still had the farm. They both were still living on the property,
and
but it was sorry.
no, I mean it's just I love that they adapted how they, turned it into a brothel and they grow
Oh
in the
yeah, yeah,
pot.
exactly.
And I mean it's incredible. So at the end, I hope that it all shifted back to more normalcy and that they managed to enjoy the last few years in.
Well, they did. No, the last few years they stopped. Like just economically, they couldn't keep going, and there was very few tourists in Zimbabwe by the sort of late 2010s, like 2018, 2019. Um, but they still lived on the property. But what was cool about it is that they became sort of quite famous, and they they would have, I mean, hundreds of people would go and knock on the door and
Oh, I
arrive at the
love
lodge
that.
with a copy of the book. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
that,
I
and
love
it
that.
gave them. I think it also gave them a certain amount of like fame and notoriety, I guess, which they loved. And also, just they ended up meeting when they had the brothel, when they had the backpackers lodge, right? They would meet thousands of people all the time and get made good friends. And then that all went away. And I think partly because of the book, they met this whole other group of people that would come through or would seek them out and would seek out the Johns and try and find Tendai and
Yeah.
people mentioned in the book, So that carried on for years. And amazing. I mean, for many years I had this idea to actually do a follow-up, um, but in which you could sort of tell the story of what had happened to them afterwards.
Yes.
And I would include that. I mean, they met like the Swedish ambassador visited them from Harare. The whole, yeah, they got
That's
hundreds of
fantastic.
stories. Yeah,
Lovely,
very fun.
lovely. And
Yeah.
then I know your mom was working on this cookbook, The Recipes for Disaster, which I really enjoyed. Did she ever get to do that? Did that ever come out?
Uh, I actually pitched that a few times in New York after the book came out, and nothing happened with it. I wish I had done something because there've been versions of it that I've seen from other parts of the world. I mean, maybe more of it is sort of uh, there's a guy now, I think he's in Gaza. He's made quite someone who making cooking in the sort of this country at war. And so
Under
he does
cooking under
videos of like today's dinner is this, incredible.
cooking
Yeah.
under pressure. Good God.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I did get a whole bunch of recipes from my mom. She had her own recipe book that my sisters have, and she was
I,
a great,
I
she was
mean, I
a great
loved the
cook.
idea that you were kind of throwing around with that one night and you're all talking, you're saying we should have a TV show and this cooking show. And I thought, yeah, it would have done fantastically because it would have been so incredibly bizarre that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Okay, and then your 2 weeks in November, that came out 3 years ago, or was it more?
yeah. Through 2020, I'm trying to 2019 and 2020. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So,
And
and
and uh, um, I'd love if you would read a little segment, and I don't mind from which book. So you can choose, but if you have something
oh,
available, if
okay,
you would just a short segment, it would be lovely if you could do that. Don't mean to put you on the
okay.
spot, put you on the spot here.
I should probably think about what I would do. So let me. So I'll find it. I
Yeah,
don't know what chapter it is, but there's a great. So when you write I mean, you've written memoirs, right?
yeah.
So you when you what's fascinating is the people that I get like I've had thousands of emails from people right about that book and who
Hmm.
either thought they knew my parents or had met my parents or just knew Zimbabwe and knew that time. I was doing an event in South Africa in Plettenberg Bay. Wow, I don't know what year, 2015 maybe, right? Um, and it was at this restaurant. There were probably like 100 people there. And there's a section in the book, and you know what I don't even know what chapter it is. I'll try and find it. But it's a bit where I'm in my parents' house and I'm asking my mother to tell me like these stories of the houses they lived in and why we like left this chicken farm to start a grape farm in the middle of a war zone, this area that was even more dangerous there than where we were, right?
Right.
And she was she would say, "Oh, well, because land was cheap, there was a war on, so we could buy it cheap." That's her one line, and then she told this
Uh,
amazing story, right? Get this, eh? She told a story about why that particular house that we were buying on this grape farm, uh, no one wanted it because it was cursed.
ooh.
Um, and one of the stories was about the previous owner, the couple who owned it. Um, the husband, I believe, had an affair. They had six children,
Ooh.
um, and the mum had got in a car with her children and driven to Mozambique
No.
and walked out into the ocean and drowned herself. Okay.
Mm.
So my mom is telling me the story. Um, and that's what I would read. Basically, I'm visiting my parents. This is when they don't have any power on in the house. Everything runs by generator. They have to grow their own food. The brothel is going strong. That's where they make their money is from just sort of running the bar and a bit of maybe my dad maybe had a few marijuana sales.
Right.
I don't know, and what's happened also is uh, their house was like it just was falling apart, right? And a rat had died in my bedroom, the room I used to sleep in. So the place smelled awful, right? So I couldn't sleep there. So I went into their living room and I slept there. And then my mom would go and smoke cigarettes in the kitchen and late at night. And then she'd come through and I started speaking to her there, right?
Okay.
Um, um, the power had gone out and my mother padded softly through with a gas lantern to get the coffee ready for the morning while I sat up in my bed. She came and stood in the living room when she was done, and we spoke for a while in the dim glow of the gaslight. Mom, was it the mortar attack in 1978 that made us leave the chicken farm? No, darling, it was the mine. It made so much bloody noise we couldn't sleep at night. Wasn't the grape farm in a more dangerous area? Oh, we didn't think of that. There was a war on. Land was cheap. She reached over to pull a box of cigarettes from the chest table drawer and she lit one. I propped myself up on the mattress. How cheap? Well, she said after a while, they said that the grape farmhouse was cursed. I loved the way my mother told a story. She spoke slowly with exaggerated drama, often pausing to look up as if to the balcony of a theater to find the right words. The original owner died after being poisoned by her dentist. The next owner had seven children. She found out her husband was having an affair with a socialite in Salisbury. She gathered her seven kids and drove to Mozambique. In Beira, she walked out into the sea and drowned herself. She took a deep drag and exhaled an elegant plume. As for the lady we brought it from, she wanted out. She had just seen her neighbor get blown sky high by a landmine while driving a tractor in his fields. Weren't you afraid to move us there? Helen was only 8. I was 10. She paused again and her mind drifted back to that time. A little, but I spoke to that house. For days I sat in the living room before we moved in, sewing the curtains, and I said to it, be good to us, be good to us. We were never attacked, I said. No, she smiled, but close. Neil Barry's place was shot up in the middle of the day once. Don't you remember? Dad was away on army call-up. We were all in the swimming pool except Helen, who was riding her bike on the road outside. I had to run and get her while the attack was underway. We found out the gooks had camped the night before beside our fence right by the swimming pool. Their fires were still warm. You must have been mad to move us here, I said. She took a last deep drag. That's what our friends said. And then 2 years later, the war was over and we owned a wine farm. That's when our friends said, those Rogerses, lucky bastards. But yeah, I wanted to tell you that's the follow on to that story, right?
Uh,
So, like your parents tell you these stories, and there's really how do I have any way of checking it? So when she told me that story about the mom of those seven children
the
drowning
curse.
herself,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So well, I mean, how do you? That's like an urban legend, you know. How do you know if that's true or not? Anyway, so I told you I was giving this. I was at a book event in Plettenberg Bay. I was in this restaurant and I was about to give this talk or a reading, and this man came up to me. He said, "Hey, I read your book," and I said, "Oh, thank you." You know, he said, I'm from Zimbabwe. You got one thing wrong though."
Ooh.
And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "There were six of us, not seven." And he was one of the children of that. His mother was the one who drowned herself. And like I
Wow.
just had shivers down my spine
Yeah,
when,
wow.
you know, crazy.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, it's such a story. And I was like looking through and I'm going, it's really dense. It's so full. I mean, there's just so much happening and it's all pretty out there. I mean, it's like a normal day is not a normal day.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Um, oh, I wanted to ask, is there any talk of it being made into a film or maybe a TV series or anything like that?
Um, More the other book, more the 2 weeks in November book, but yeah, I've had it. This book it was optioned by the BBC. I've had like three different production companies
Hmm.
interested. At the moment, it's not under option, but I think it's just great. I mean,
It would
a
be
TV show, like a
fabulous.
series. Yeah, yeah. I think it
Yeah.
would work well. Um, so my other one, I'm working on a pilot for a 6 or 7 part series that I want to
And
develop. So,
and is that taking place in Zimbabwe as well?
well, so no, that would be the 2 weeks in November book. Yeah, it would.
Okay.
I don't you'd shoot it in Zimbabwe, but similar idea, like a 6, 7 part show. I think would suit it.
Yeah.
Suit it.
Yeah.
So I mean, I have the interest in these, in both of them.
Well,
But
because
so far nothing's
I
been
mean,
made.
they're just so colorful and they could just they would just be beautiful. They could I mean they kind of have
Yeah,
all these flavors and I mean they have the profound moments, the hilarious moments, the
yeah, yeah,
tragic moments, the really terrifying moments. I mean, it's got everything. So yeah.
yeah, yeah. Thank you. Well, if you know of anyone that's
Yeah.
wants to make it, all right, let me
I
know.
will definitely. And then I was going to ask you one last thing. I was just going to say, do you have a favorite memoir? Like, what's one of your favorite ones?
Uh, I have two.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning, which
Mm-hmm.
is Laurie Lee's book. It's just incredible. He's writing it probably maybe 30 or 40 years later after he did this trip. But it's the story of him as a kid. I think he was like 18 or 19-year-old boy in England, and he walks to Spain. He basically, one morning, he gets up and he literally walks from the Cotswolds
Wow.
to Spain, and it's in the months leading up to the Spanish Civil War. So
Wow.
it's a story of his walking from I think he arrives in Galicia or northern Spain and goes all the way down to the south. And he must have written copious notes or just had this photographic memory, but his eye for detail and description is amazing. But
Yeah.
there's a really powerful bit near the end where the war hasn't begun yet, right? But but he speaks to someone, or he's in a cafe, and someone comes up to him and he said, "If I were you, I'd start thinking about getting out of here. There's going to be a lot of blood spilled very soon." And it's something like that, some line like,
Yeah.
"There's going to be
Yeah.
a lot of killing coming," and then I don't know how he got home. He might have walked all the way back. I don't know, or got a ship. But
Yeah.
that's for me is like one of the
Yeah.
great memories. Um, Nabokov, Speak Memory,
Hmm.
Nabokov's book about mostly about growing up in, well, a lot of it's about being a kid in Russia before the revolution.
Hmm.
That's incredible. And then it talks about him going to England, and it's very strangely enough not very political book because you would think like if you were this sort of landowning family and liberal family in outside of St. Petersburg, and then you saw everything destroyed, that you'd be angry and you'd be sort of talking about like how the communists have destroyed everything. But
Right.
yeah, but he doesn't really, he barely touches on it. But that is just, to me, it's just so beautiful.
Mm.
Um, And there's one other, which is, do you know Elia Kazan, the film director who did On the Waterfront and then famously Named Names
Hmm.
in the 60s, sort of outed the communists in Hollywood. His memoir is incredible as well. It's called
Ah,
Alive. Elia
alive.
Kazan. He was sort of shunned for a while, I guess, in Hollywood circles, but
I'm sure he was.
probably understandable
I'm
reasons.
sure he
Yeah,
was.
yeah, but his book is beautiful. And that's another story, immigrant story, because he grew up in Greece. He's a Greek Turk, a Greek family from Turkey,
Right.
and getting out of before they slaughtered the Armenians, actually.
Yeah.
But that's also a story about someone fleeing like
Right.
revolution.
I
And
mean, I can see how that sort of ties into your own life.
yes, exactly.
So,
Those three stories are actually kind
yes,
of in a way tied
yes,
up.
right.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you actually, where were you born? Were you born in Zimbabwe?
Yes, I was. I was born in Mutare, where
Okay,
the book is set. Yeah,
right.
in
Because it's weird
68.
that, isn't it? Because, like you said, even though you're born there and it's your country, it's almost like you're not supposed to be there, and that's so difficult. I mean, I always felt that in South Africa too. It's like, yes, it's my place, but I'm not African.
Yeah, but
I never belong. And then I
well,
moved to
what's
America,
interesting,
and it's like you're not American if you move to America, and it's like,
right, right. But it's interesting for our parents' generation. I don't know how far back your parents were in South Africa, but my parents would never leave Zimbabwe. They're like,
yeah,
nah, this is where we're
yeah,
from. And it's weird. You think you develop more roots the older you got. I mean, the more generations went on, but instead, like we uprooted ourselves
yeah.
and
Yeah, no,
wider
I
force.
mean, my parents moved there when I was a kid. I wasn't born there, but I
Yeah.
grew up there. But I'm very glad that I grew up there because I feel like I got to experience a pretty fantastic childhood.
How
So,
long have you been in Portugal? You
no,
live in Portugal?
I moved to America and I lived in California for many years, and then I've just moved to Portugal 2 years ago. So it's all new. And you know
Oh,
what? It reminds me so much of South Africa. And my neighbor
yeah.
is from Nelspruit.
Oh,
I'm like, I'm like, what?
that's amazing.
Yeah, there's a
That's
lot of
amazing.
South Africans here, and I hear people speaking Afrikaans. I'm like, this is wild.
What, are you in Lisbon? Where are you?
I'm about a half hour away from Lisbon. I'm in a place called Cascais, and
I've heard of that.
it's
Yeah, yeah.
beautiful, and I mean everyone speaks English here, so it's pretty easy. But I was going to ask you, so what is next for you? Are you working on another memoir? What are you working on
Yeah.
right now?
So I'm doing that pilot. So the script
Right?
for um, my 2 weeks in November book. But then I want to write the book. I've sort of mapped it out pretty well. Before I wrote that book, I actually was on a road trip with three friends of mine
Hmm.
to Mozambique to track down an old school friend of mine who I heard was in jail in Mozambique for arms dealing.
Okay.
So the reason, so we did a road trip in 2017 in a battered Mercedes Benz into remote Mozambique, and and then what happened halfway through that trip, the coup was happening in Zimbabwe. So we kind of left and drove back to Zimbabwe, and sort of that's where I found that I discovered that crazy story that I tell in 2 weeks in November. But I actually want to tell the original story I set out to write. So it's a book about, I think I'm calling it A Leap Over the White Picket Fence. And it's basically about, it's The Hangover set in Africa. It's four guys on a road trip who've been let out by their wives to say, okay, you can go away for 2 weeks. And uh, so it's,
I mean,
like a buddy story, but with the of adventure.
I think you're actually very brave because I mean, these things can get really hairy and out of control and dangerous. And I mean, even,
Well, I'm not brave at all, but yeah, we got caught up in something quite exciting on that trip, which we didn't intend. But
no,
I think
I think you are brave. And then you go and interview people that you know are being watched. And I mean, I think you're brave.
ah well,
Yeah.
then tell my children that's what they need to get. Yeah, I'm good at getting people to talk to me,
Hmm.
um, put myself in positions where I find a story, and
Yeah.
um, And that's why I was lucky to put The Last Resort to have my parents just sort of live this crazy life and then tell it to me.
I mean, it
So
is,
I was
it's really
that gift
fabulous.
by them.
It's really fabulous.
Yeah.
And I think you did
Uh,
them proud with that story. I think you did it very well. And I'm sad that your father never read it because, but no, it's beautifully written. And yeah, and I look forward to reading the one about Mozambique. You'll jump over, what is it? Leap over the white picket
A
fence.
Leap Over the White Picket Fence, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of telling it's like The Hangover set in Africa, but with Kalashnikovs. And, yeah.
All right. Well, I look forward to that. And well, thank you so much for coming on the show today and for talking to us. And yeah, and
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.